The reading this morning starts with maintain justice and do what is right. And I want to begin by sharing some names with you. You're almost guaranteed to recognize the first two and the last, and hopefully the last name that I'll read, though you might not know a lot of these. Breonna Taylor, George Floyd, Amber Gwibosh, Angela Poorman, Audrey Desjardins, Brenda Campbell, Diane Bignell, Janine Fontaine, Kathleen Leary, Crystal Andrews, Leah Anderson, Marilyn Monroe, not that Marilyn Monroe, a different one, Mildred Flett, Rosalind Gabriel, Simone Sanderson, Tanya Nepinek, Teresa Robinson, Tiffany Skye, and Tina Fontaine. Other than the first two, which you might recognize from two African-American people who were killed in the U.S. recently, and that we all know their names now, George Floyd and Breonna Taylor, the rest of these names are missing or murdered Indigenous women. These names that I read are just names from Manitoba, from our own province, and these are the names of the ones that are recorded only between 2010 and 2018. 18 women and girls in that time period went missing or were murdered. I looked up how many missing and murdered Indigenous women there have been in the last 50 to 60 years, 70 years, I guess. There's been an inquiry into that. The report was released a year ago here in Canada. And I thought I should find out how many there have been. I couldn't get an accurate number, and that's actually a huge problem because the records are hard to find. Even in the inquiry itself, it's stated that missing Indigenous women in Canada go terribly underreported and undocumented. And so the estimates range from 1,000 to over 4,000 women have gone missing or been killed from the 1950s to the present day. This morning, we're going to talk about protest. We're going to talk about racial justice, in particular in Canada. We're going to talk about our hesitancy and our fear. We're going to talk about what it means to go from the particular to the universal, as opposed to from the universal to the particular. We'll come to that in a minute. And then we're going to talk very specifically about our text that Jen read. And in particular, we're going to look at instructions given to God's people from God that are directly relevant to this text, which may also be directly relevant to us. And then also a hope that is in our text today. But this hope is a bit of a double-edged sword. It might be comforting and also challenging to us. But first I want to say just a couple of words about protest, because we've seen all kinds of protests, and some of you who are watching today have participated in protests, in peaceful protests. I know a number of our congregation members participated in Black Lives Matter marches here in Winnipeg. Why protest? Why not just have civil conversation? Why not get people to the table and have conversations and try to work things out? And I think there's actually a fairly simple answer to this. It's because we have had conversations. That's actually happened. And systems are either slow to change or completely unchanged. So many of us know that in Canada, the Truth and Reconciliation Commission happened, and there were all kinds of recommendations coming out of that, some of which are in the process of being implemented, and some of those things are wonderful things. But many of the recommendations are ignored. 1 year ago, As I mentioned, the Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women report was released and published, and you can go and find it online. It was released 1 year ago, and I want to read to you just 2 or 3 little sections of that report. It's not long, and we are coming to the biblical text, okay? So stick with me through this. But this is important to understand. I think it's really actually important to understand our context as Canadians. And it's right here in black and white. You can go and read the reports. Here are just a couple of quotes from what is a very, very long report. It says, colonial violence as well as racism, sexism, homophobia, and transphobia against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people has become embedded in everyday life. Whether this is through interpersonal forms of violence, through institutions like the healthcare system and the justice system, or in the laws, policies, and structures of Canadian society, the result has been that many Indigenous people have grown up normalized to violence, while Canadian society shows an appalling apathy to address the issue. The National Inquiry into Missing and Murdered Indigenous Women and Girls finds that this amounts to genocide. Wow. Like this report is a year old. Where is this in our news? There were a couple of news stories this past May and June, kind of on the 1-year anniversary. Here's another quote from the report. Throughout this report, as witnesses shared, we convey truths about state actions and inactions rooted in colonialism and colonial ideologies built on the presumption of superiority and utilized to maintain power and control over the land and the people by oppression, and in many cases, by eliminating them. That was written a year ago. In some ways, I want to say only a year ago, but in other ways, I want to say, are we not paying attention? It could be written today, and it probably should have been written far longer than just a year ago. The first recommendation that comes out of the report, there are actually 231 what they call calls to justice. And I want to read to you the first recommendation. It's the last bit I'm going to read to you from this report. You can go and look it up. Here's what it says. We call upon federal, provincial, territorial, municipal, and Indigenous governments, after we're going to call this all governments, in partnership with Indigenous people to develop and implement a national action plan to address violence against Indigenous women, girls, and 2S LGBTQIA people, as recommended in our interim report and in support of existing recommendations by other bodies of inquiry and other reports. So they're saying, we're recommending all governments come up with a national action plan to address violence, and in particular, addressing this violence against Indigenous women and girls. Come up with an action plan. Here's the rest of this. As part of the National Action Plan, we call upon all governments to ensure that equitable access to basic rights such as employment, housing, education, safety, and healthcare is recognized as a fundamental means of protecting Indigenous and human rights, resourced and supported as rights-based programs founded on substantive equality. All programs must be no barrier and must apply regardless of status or location. Now, when I read that recommendation, I think, really? We need that? Like, listen to what it's asking. We call upon governments to ensure that equitable access to basic rights such as employment, housing, education, safety, and healthcare is recognized as a fundamental means of protecting Indigenous and human rights. Just that it's recognized. Throughout the report, words like immediately, immediate action needed, all this kind of stuff show up in the report. The federal government in Canada promised that they would respond to this by June, but because of COVID, there has been a plea to say, well, please wait, we're working on it. I want to ask, what was the Canadian government doing on this between last June and February? Now, that's maybe why we need some protest, why we need to say and speak up and say this isn't right. There's been reports, there's been conversations, and there's been pleas and pleas for action. And we need that action. But here's what I want to share with you today, because this is church. This isn't about like government policy, right? This is something different. What do we actually pay attention to as the people of God? Or really just as people in general? Do we in fact pay attention to reports and roundtable discussions and recommendations? I think we can. I think we sometimes do. But primarily, we actually need stories. We need to hear the names of people. We need to hear that I actually only read 17, not 18 names, because I couldn't read one name, because she had no name. One of the girls that was murdered in that time period in Manitoba was only 9 months old and hadn't been named. What do we pay attention to? This is in our country, on our watch. And this is why I wanted to share with you about this idea of going from the particular to the universal. So the particular is, let's talk about this one child. But we actually do a lot of talking in the universal or in generalities. And we're actually terrible at acting out of the universal. Like, we're terrible at going from the universal to the particular. We're not good at that. We're way better at going from the particular to the universal. Maybe it's because those particular stories like touch us in some way. So we can say things like, we know we're supposed to love everyone as Christians. We're supposed to love everyone. Great. I have no problem with that. But when we're asked to actually love the particular person right in front of you, it becomes harder. That is sometimes hard to do. So yeah, love everybody, absolutely. But this person, that's harder. And then we start asking questions, well, how? What does it really look like to love the person right in front of you? And those questions are sometimes just blockades and barriers, right? Because it's sort of like, well, I don't really want to. And then we have to examine, well, why is that? Jesus was actually a master at going from the particular to the universal, right? And you see this actually in the development of the Gospels and the Jesus story. And then what happens with the church is they start to figure out the universal on the basis of the particular actions that Jesus did. He even did this in his storytelling. So one of the best ones for this is the Good Samaritan. We're really familiar with it. Someone asks, what am I supposed to do with my life? Jesus says, follow the law. And the summary of the law is basically to love God with heart, soul, mind, and strength, and to love your neighbor as yourself. And this lawyer who's talking to Jesus says, but who is my neighbor? And that's when Jesus tells this story of the Good Samaritan. And he says, there's this man who's been walking along the road and he's beaten up by robbers and they take everything. And this priest comes along and walks along and sees the man. And we're comfortable in this story right now. We're fine because a priest, he's one of us. But the priest walks over to the other side and ignores the man. Then a scribe shows up and we're comfortable. We're, okay, good. Someone's going to come help this guy on the road. But he doesn't. He crosses the road and goes to the other side. And then a Samaritan, and if we want to talk about racial tension, it's between Jews and Samaritans. The Samaritan shows up, and the people listening to this story are really uncomfortable with this. What? A Samaritan? They're uncomfortable now. Jesus has just made the crowd uncomfortable because it's not the regular person. It's not the expected one who helps. It's someone who shouldn't help, someone who should keep their distance, someone who should stay in their own country. Thank you very much. Stay in your neighborhood and I'll stay in my neighborhood. But it's that man who comes alongside and helps. That's what the Good Samaritan's actually about. So when we hear cries or we say Black Lives Matter, we've got to understand what's happening here. This is a particular to the universal. And I'll admit that when I first heard this Black Lives Matter, I heard years ago now, I thought, that's political. And contrary to today's sermon, I don't usually do politics in the pulpit. And so I wouldn't say Black Lives Matter because that's politics. And I didn't think that it was actually about justice. And I mean, there's lots of buzz about justice and people talking about justice. I mean God's just and right world. God's justice, God's right world, God's reign that is to come. That's what I'm talking about. But the thing is, something like Black Lives Matter, it's actually way more than a political slogan. It is actually a political slogan. That's okay. But it's way more than that. This is about people. This is about women and children and girls and boys. And I want you to think about this. If you're someone who's like, well, I don't know about that, think about this. As kids return to school and people are concerned about health and all of that that's happening right now, we might say, you know what, our kids matter. And who would respond, well, no, you shouldn't really say that. But you should say everyone matters as kids go back to school. No one would object to saying our kids matter. When it's Armed Forces Day at a sporting event, like at the Jets game, I've been there when it's Armed Forces Night, and everyone appreciates the military with a standing ovation, we don't say, well, let's acknowledge all the civilians too, because it's not just about the armed forces. No, we're appreciating and honoring and standing with a particular group of people. And this is the whole point. We actually need the particular. The fact that some of us kind of balk at Black Lives Matter, that actually tells us that there is a problem. This tells us that we actually need to say it. It tells us that we must be even more particular and also say the names. The fact that I am even slightly afraid to talk about this today, wondering what people out there might think, that means we have a problem. See, the thing is, if all people are God's children, if Jesus came to embrace all, then we must be appalled when any person is harmed. We must be appalled and angry at racism or at any injustice. Even any latent racism within ourselves, and especially injustice within our systems. But often, we aren't appalled at generalities. So we don't get appalled at someone saying systemic racism. We get sort of irked by them saying it. See, it isn't enough to say things like all people are God's children. We should say that. That's a good thing to say, but it isn't enough to say it. And I think a big reason why is that for centuries and centuries, one group of people would say that, and they wouldn't really mean that another group was actually included in it. All people are God's children. They could speak in the generality, in the universal, but they could not act in the particular. See, it's not enough to just say that. If you're not getting what I'm saying, here's what I'm saying. White men used to say that from pulpits, but when they said all people, they didn't mean women. They didn't mean black people. They didn't mean indigenous people. They didn't mean anyone but themselves. Now, sure, in the universal, in the generalities, they did mean everyone. Yeah. But not in the particular, right? Not in their actions. Not when it came to the actual real life and death situations. Or the things that we might not even consider life and death, like voting rights. or access to education. Or if we want to be even more current in Canada with our Indigenous people, access to clean drinking water, talk about rights, or jobs. And here's the thing, when we want to shout the universal, the general, all lives matter, but won't face the particular Black Lives Matter, we are doing the same thing as our forebears. All people are God's children. Yeah, but how does that actually play out? And some of us might respond like, well, hey, you know what? Life actually isn't fair, right? If we're talking about justice, it's been really hard for me too. Life's not fair, it's hard for me. But let's think about the Christian response here. The people of God in scriptures are reminded over and over and over again to remember what it was like to be slaves in Egypt. Remember, you were once slaves in Egypt. That's told over again in the Hebrew scriptures. And they are told to do this not so they can say, hey, we've been through hardships too, and now we deserve a break. They're actually told to do this so that they will not mistreat others. Remember what it was like to not be in the promised land, to be, in fact, a slave. Remember what it was like, because wouldn't you have wanted some help or support or some encouragement when you were in that position? Imagine if just one or two of your oppressors, when you were having your very hard life, would have stood up for you. Well, the thing is, if you have any kind of power today, you have the opportunity to do that for others. All right, let's look more specifically at our text today, because it gives instruction directly to those who have power, and it doles out this amazing hope for those that don't, for the disenfranchised. So Jen mentioned this when she read it. She said the lectionary reading is actually Isaiah 56, verse 1, and then 6 to 8, but we're reading the whole thing. Breaking up of text happens a lot in the Revised Common Lectionary, and I always like to look at what has been left out. Which verses are they not doing? But first, I want to read to you again the reading that is what the lectionary actually gives us. This is the lectionary says, read verse 1 and then read 6 to 8. Here's what this is. Thus says the Lord, maintain justice and do what is right, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance will be revealed. And the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord, to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it, and will hold fast to my covenant. These I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Thus says the Lord God, who gathers the outcasts of Israel. I will gather others to them besides those already gathered. Okay, this is actually the universal. Okay, it's not totally universal. Like there's a bit of particularity to the universal here. Verse 6 is talking about the foreigners will be gathered to the holy mountain, to the temple. So it's not everyone here in that verse. It's specifically outsiders. So it's doing an okay job there. But here the universal in this, right? Verse 7, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. Jesus even quotes that verse when he clears the temple. And yes, absolutely, that's totally true. Verse 8 is sort of have a bit of a combination of the particular and the universal, but it says God will gather the outcasts of Israel and others besides those already gathered. Great. People of God are in, and some other people. Great. Bring them in. That'll be lovely. We love new people. Let's have them here. But the piece that is actually left out of the lectionary is far more particular than this. And so we have at the beginning a command or advice for the people of Israel, and then we have that followed up by a powerful image of what God is going to do. So here's going back into verse 3. It says, do not let the foreigner joined to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. Two things. Israel's understanding of God's love is really almost equivalent with inclusion in the people of Israel, in the covenant people. So if you are outside of God's covenant people, it's kind of like, well, then we don't even consider you. That was kind of the prevailing wisdom. separation from God's people is essentially equivalent with rejection by God. It is the worst possible thing that can happen to you in that worldview. And then, so that's the first bit, right? So you've got, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. Don't let the foreigner say that, right? That's what is said. The second one is, the second image that's used is a tree that is not bearing fruit. And it's a powerful image, and you might, if you've been around church long enough, you might hear a verse. It's actually from the New Testament, but it's actually kind of prevailing wisdom. All trees that are not fruit-bearing trees shall be cut down and thrown into the fire. Right? And God, in this passage through the prophet, says to Israel, this is saying it to the nation, to the people who are in power. God says, don't let the foreigner or the eunuch say these kinds of things about themselves. So imagine this. God's vision for his people when they are in power is to actively challenge the self-perception of the disenfranchised when they are bringing themselves down. Because that isn't how God's kingdom actually is. Because the foreigners and the eunuchs, and that's getting really particular, the people who prevailing wisdom said should not be included, in fact, are included. But what is most challenging about this is that these perceptions that they may have had of themselves, it actually wasn't really just them, right? If they talked about themselves in this way, it was actually because it was embedded in Israel, in the Israelite society that they were living in. Right? It wasn't as though they just came up with this on their own, the foreigners and the eunuchs saying, yeah, we're never going to be included. We're not part of God's people. It didn't start with them. It was actually embedded in Israelite society. In other words, it was systemic, to use a word of today. Foreigners actually were supposed to be kept away from the temple. Gentiles, is another way of talking about the foreigners, were not allowed. That was the rule. There was also specific prohibition, a law that would have banned eunuchs from the temple. They did not have access. But here, through the prophet, God says, actually, go to them and let them know that they don't need to think about themselves that way anymore. They should not be thinking about themselves that way as outside. They need to think about themselves as inside. As part of this, as part of my covenant people, as part of the people that I love and care about, because I'm about to do something. And then here's the hope that is also challenging. So what's interesting about this is God does not say, okay, my people in power, you've got to change your structures to be more fair. That's how we actually want it always to work, okay? And I mean, we should try and do that. Like, let's actually try and do that. That would be good. But God is actually working on an even grander scale than that. And it is God's action and God's promise from where we need to take our cues for how to do what it says in verse 1. Maintain justice and do what is right. So here's what God promises for the eunuchs who are never supposed to enter the temple. Okay? It says, for thus says the Lord, to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbath, who choose to do the things that please me and hold fast to my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters, which is the way God talks about the Israelites, sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off. To these people who, they were thought to mostly be servants or officials in the king's residence in the palace, at least if you go far enough back in the Israelite tradition. These ones who are banned from the temple are seen as less than, that are excluded. It says God will give a monument and a name better than sons and daughters, an everlasting name. Who gets a statue? The excluded, the outsider, the ones without power. That's who gets a statue in the kingdom of God. Who does God honor with a monument? Is it John A. MacDonald? Or maybe it's Breonna Taylor or Channing Wenjack or Tina Fontaine. Or maybe it's the 9-month-old baby girl. Who never had a name. God gives her one better than any of us might have, and it is everlasting.